Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast, drilling down into one issue facing Israel and the Jewish world. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, joined by Micah Goodman, philosopher and, dare I say it, friend. Thanks for letting me join you today.
Thank you. It's so nice to be in a podcast again.
We have been speaking since the terrible massacre of October 7th about every half a year for the podcast. So we're looking ahead right now and behind and at this very uncertain moment. But I'd like to begin with something that you said in our first podcast since the massacre.
Yeah, 2 days after the massacre, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was a morning of strong emotions. Both of us had just heard news of losing loved ones. And we talked about a cocktail of emotions then. It's definitely real, it's raw, and it's worth listening to. But at that point, you also started describing something that has really occupied listeners' thoughts. And recently somebody wrote me about the idea of the zero-sum game. So let's talk, first of all, explain what do you mean by this?
Yeah, I think about it a little bit differently now. But in the first week of the war, we put it this way. Israel has to protect its reputation, but we have two different reputations to protect. We want one kind of reputation when it comes to the Western civilization, and a different kind of reputation when it comes to the Middle East, and especially the jihadist forces within the Middle East. So when it comes to the West, we want the West to see us as a country that protects human rights, that plays according to the rules, and we always want to be loved by the West and loved by America. And in some sense, maybe love is a strong word. We want to be liked. We want to be appreciated. We want to be seen as one of the good guys of the West. That's a reputation we want to protect. And I know Jews in America are obsessed about that reputation. You have a bad reputation. You have to look better. It's not, I know. We have to protect the reputation in the West. The thing is, there's also another reputation we need to protect, and that's in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, we want to be seen as unpredictable, as a little bit crazy, as people that have what it takes to go all the way to get what needs to be done. So we put it this way, we want to be loved in the West, we want to be feared in the Middle East. And we asked an average Israeli after October 7th, when he or she needs to fall asleep at night, what emotion will protect us more, love or fear, the love of the West or the fear of the Middle East? And I think we all know the answer. We'd rather be feared by the jihadi forces in the Middle East than loved by different people in the West. But there's a problem. There's a zero-sum game here. Everything that we needed to do and still need to do in order to make the jihadi forces in the Middle East fear us, those actions will make more and more people in the West turn their backs on us. Oh, and everything we will not do, right, in order to protect the reputation in the West and keep the West liking us, will erode a reputation in the Middle East. It will block their ability to fear us again. That was our formulation in week one. Am I remembering this correctly?
I think so, yeah. And It's just fascinating to go back to that time, of course, because we have to remember that we were so loved on that day.
That's right.
That Biden had just embraced us with the biggest bear hug possible.
And Bono from U2 was singing songs about the people from the music festival. We were so loved in the West, but we were so not feared in the Middle East.
Correct.
The jihadi forces were looking at Israel and these people are weak. And now hunting season is opened.
And I think in terms of the public opinion, hunting season was open very quickly. Perhaps by November even, Israel was no longer the cause célèbre,
That's right. So this is the way I formulate it now is that not zero-sum game between love and fear, but there is a complicated relationship between deterrence and legitimacy. We need to deter the Middle East, but we need legitimacy that comes from the United States of America and the West. The thing is, in order to deter the Middle East, we need to go to a war. And to go to the war, we need legitimacy from the West. The problem is everything we do to restore deterrence erodes legitimacy. So the big question is, what's going to happen first? Will we restore deterrence before we ran out of legitimacy? Here's a metaphor. Imagine the war as a car and the car has a destiny. The destiny is restoring deterrence. The gasoline tank is legitimacy. The question is, what will happen first? Will we reach our destiny before we ran out of gasoline? Before we ran out of legitimacy? Or will we run out of legitimacy before we reach in the middle of the road? Before we reach our goal, before we restore deterrence? And I want to answer that question. I think the past year, Israel has managed to use up every drop of legitimacy. But on the last drops of legitimacy, we've managed to restore deterrence. We've somehow managed to pull that off. Because the past year showed this neighborhood that Israel is capable of two different things. What we did in Gaza was one thing, and well, I want to be careful here because we're in the beginning of the campaign in Lebanon. What we've been doing in Lebanon till now is a different thing. And what we've done in Gaza has shown the Middle East that Israelis are willing to go all the way. And it's something that they didn't know about us. It's something, Amanda, that we didn't know about ourselves. That we have very strong will. And we're willing to go all the way, even if it means stomaching losses, which is very hard for us Israelis, and risking our soldiers' everyday casualties. And we didn't back out. And we're also willing to continue moving forward and not giving up, not only while we lose our soldiers, but also while there is also against massive international pressure not to go into Rafah, not to go into Philadelphia, not to continue, and Israel has managed to stomach all of that and to go all the way, which means in Gaza, we showed the power of our will. But will is not enough. We also have to show that we have capabilities, that we have sophisticated technologies, that we could use them in a very creative way. And Amanda, that is what we're showing in Lebanon. That combination of brilliance, Lebanon, will, Gaza, strong will, plus incredible brilliance, that combination is, I think, restoring our deterrence. Our enemies are looking at us now and they're saying two things. One, these people are a little bit crazy, unpredictable. They're willing to go all the way. It's impossible to stop them. And they're extremely capable and creative. And that combination, I think, is a combination that we managed to create in the past year. Gaza plus Lebanon, will plus high capabilities. I think that's restoring our deterrence in the Middle East. And we've managed to restore our deterrence before we lost our legitimacy.
Why do you think we have not lost our legitimacy?
Because because the world didn't stop us yet. We went all the way in Gaza. The world didn't stop us. I mean, we suffered a lot of blows to our legitimacy, but we managed to go all the way to Rafah and Gaza. And now in Lebanon, as we are recording this podcast, I have no idea what will happen the next minute. But as we're recording this podcast, the world is not stopping us while we are dramatically eroding Hezbollah's capabilities and exposing their hidden weaknesses. They seemed untouchable. They seemed invincible. And now the Middle East, while the Sunni forces in the Middle East are laughing at Hezbollah, they are amazed by the creativity and the brilliance of the Israeli army. And that's after they were amazed by how determined and strong-willed the Israeli society is, like it was proven in Gaza. So the world gave us a hard time in Gaza and Lebanon, and it was close to stopping us, but it didn't. So again, we've managed to waste almost all legitimacy, but with the last drops of legitimacy, we've managed to restore deterrence. And I don't know how the campaign in Lebanon will continue from now, but I think when we turn to the challenge of week one to rebuild our reputation in the Middle East, I think Gaza plus Lebanon did that.
Okay, so deterrence, I would agree with you. We're well on the way to rebuild that. But let's talk about the idea of legitimacy, because it's obviously not the same thing as good public opinion or even a good reputation or love, as we were discussing before.
That's right. I would think just legitimacy, in its very basic sense, is our ability to fight a war without running out of ammunition. And when our enemies, when they look at us, they know that they're not looking just at us. There is also the United States somewhere behind us. And as long as we have the enough ammunition and the perception that it's not just us, America is behind us, I think those are the two pieces that if all legitimacy was wasted, we probably wouldn't have had enough ammunition, and the Middle East would look at Israel and stop believing that America is behind Israel. And the fact that those two elements are still alive shows to us that while we wasted, and sometimes in a reckless way, large chunks of our legitimacy, we have just enough legitimacy left in order to do what we're doing now, to restore our deterrence.
One of the things that, in my mind, really restored a lot of our deterrence was the attack on the Yemeni port after, of course, being taunted and baited by the Houthi rebels. But if you want to talk about crazy, we have many of these rebel militias who are taunting us and continuing to bait the bear, even though they perhaps intellectually know that the U.S. is behind them. They're even attacking the U.S. Where do you go from there?
I don't know. I just know that deterrence is a story. And deterrence is not just about tomorrow's battle. It's about the next decade. And when the jihadi forces of the Middle East will look at Israel when all this is over, and they have to ask themselves, is it worthwhile investing in rebuilding our army to attack Israel again when we know that Israel has such strong will like we saw in Gaza and such high capabilities like we saw in Lebanon? And I hope the story will be, a narrative was emerging within the Shiite world, and that is that Israelis have high capabilities but very weak will. They don't have what it takes. That was the narrative. That was the narrative of Hassan Nasrallah in his famous speech in Minchville in 2000. That's the narrative of Ali Khamenei in a famous speech in 2015. Israelis have great technology, high-level technology, but very low level of will and willing to sacrifice. And while before October 7th, they think we have very weak will, but very high capabilities, October 7th showed them that we even have weak capabilities. So no will, no capabilities. And that was the moment where we recorded our first podcast. That's the reputation we had to rebuild. And I think what we rebuilt is both of them. They see we have strong will. We show that in Gaza. They see we still have the highest capabilities. We're showing that in every page of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. We're showing that if this will continue. So I think a story is being created that it might shift when they're asking us to invest, if Iran wants to rebuild its proxies or not rebuild its proxies, when they believe that Israel is something we have no will, no willing to fight, their proxies can bring them down, that investment is worth it. But the people of Iran will have to ask themselves a question: will they let their ayatollahs and their regime to invest their money in a failed project?
I am so confused about the last point, because you had me until there. But why should Iran care if their proxies are so expendable? Who cares if another, 100 Hydra heads, grows in its place?
They might not care, but the people of Iran obviously care. The people are right now, as there is an Israeli that observes social media in Iran. Her name is Tamal Gindin, and she was saying that protesters in Iran are saying, don't spend Iranian money building Hamas and Hezbollah. And this was before this war. After this war, that question grows. Don't spend Iranian taxpayers' money in Iran and Hezbollah, but if you spent it, at least those are effective proxies. But it turns out if Israel in 6 hours destroyed investments of 10 years in Lebanon, that's according to sources in the Israeli military, they're always quoted now. So you're asking, wow, all that investment of Iranian taxpayers' money that could have gone to build a better healthcare for Iranians, better infrastructure for Iranians, taking care of their number one problem, which is drought and lack of water. And all this money went to invest in a proxy like Hezbollah. And within 6 hours, the Israeli Air Force erased investment of 10 years. I think the Iranians have serious questions to ask their regime. That's deterrence. When that question is asked, then you know that Israel has rebuilt its reputation in the Middle East.
I look at what's happening right now And it appears to me that Hezbollah is being incredibly restrained in its responses to everything that's been going on, confirmed or unconfirmed, as Israeli work. Of course, we're talking about the large-scale pager attack and the walkie-talkie attacks. And I just wonder if Iran itself hasn't yet said, okay, go ahead, unleash the tigers.
I have no idea how the regime thinks and what the Ayatollahs are thinking, but I'll tell you what makes sense. That there is one, we're recording this and maybe a minute later, all this is not relevant anymore. But Iran made an investment in accurate missiles that Hezbollah has. And those are the accurate missiles that Israelis were afraid of. They could knock down strategic centers in Israel, electricity, water facilities, the airports, the ports in Haifa and in Ashdod. They could do a lot of damage to us, these accurate missiles. And the reason why Iran built those missiles for them was to deter Israel from attacking Iran, from attacking the nuclear facilities in Iran. Because Iran itself, as we saw on April 14th, can't really shoot in Israel missiles. It shot 300 missiles, but we knocked them all out because Iran is very far away. Hezbollah, on the other hand, if it sends 30 accurate missiles to a strategic site in Israel, they have a chance to believe that 1 or 2 will enter and to create strategic damage for Israel. So, and by the way, that project has worked. I think investing in accurate missiles in Lebanon is deterring Israel from attacking the nuclear reactors in Iran. I think that works. So now Iran is asking, if they don't let Hezbollah to use those strategic weapons against Israel, so they're actually letting Hezbollah just to be exposed to Israel bombing them without their ability to fight back. So that's a lose situation for them. But if they let Hezbollah shoot these accurate missiles on Israel, that gives Israel legitimacy to attack the locations of those missiles. And it's very possible that some of them are in Beirut and they will cause a lot of damage. And we can't attack them without, I think the calculation of Israel is if we attack them and kill many civilians without being attacked first by them, we might lose our legitimacy. It might end the war. America might turn their backs on us. I think that's a fear that we have. So if they attack us with accurate missiles and then we destroy all their missiles, guess what? Iran can't deter Israel anymore from attacking its nuclear facilities. So if they use them, they're exposed. And if they don't use them, they're humiliated. They're in a lose-lose situation. And until now, Israel was always in a position where it has only bad options. Finally, Iran is in a corner where it has only bad options. That ability to transfer to Iran the tragic situation, we have to make a bad decision only because the alternative is also bad. That's the success of the past 2 weeks in Lebanon. That's the success of Israel restoring its deterrence. What will Iran choose? I have no idea. I hope they'll try to avoid this tragic dilemma by trying to end this war through trying to put pressure on Sinwar to make a deal with Israel and then to try to end the whole thing. Can they find Sinwar? Do they have leverage over Sinwar? I don't know the answer. It's all very, very messy. But that's the best way. Right now, Iran is in a situation where its most rational way out of the catch they're in is in the hands of Yahya Sinwar.
Talk about a crazy situation.
Oh, and by the way, the interest of Yahya Sinwar is that Iran does go to war with Israel. So if Iran goes to war with Israel, that saves Sinwar in his calculations. And if Iran makes a deal with Israel, that saves Iran and Hezbollah. In Hezbollah and Iran's calculations. There is a massive conflict of interest right now between the empire and its proxy.
And that is, of course, assuming that Iran is the empire who stands alone. And this is something that I'm increasingly wondering about, especially when you see the forces of the globe realigning and you see China, of course, in the wings and Russia in the wings. And we've, of course, talked about how the U.S. is behind us, but who's behind Iran?
This all taps into the question of what's the story we're living in? There's 3 alternative stories that could explain this moment. You see, every action we do lives inside a narrative. And one would argue that the narrative is more important than the action because it gives meaning to the action. I'll try to explain this. I think I'm quoting Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. I think I am. 3 people are eating salad. You ask the first one, why are you eating salad? He answers, I'm on a diet. Okay, that makes sense. That's the narrative. That makes sense why you're eating salad. You ask the second one, I'm keeping kosher. Well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. There's no kosher meat restaurants. He has to eat vegetarian. Okay, fine. You ask the third one, why are you eating a salad? I'm a vegetarian. So all 3 are doing the same thing, but they're living in different stories. One person is vegetarian, one person is keeping kosher, one person is on a diet. They're doing the same action, but they're living in a different narrative. Now, I think it's fair to argue that the narrative is what gives the meaning to the action. Amanda, ever since October 7th, the past year, we're in a war. A war is a series of actions, of operations. But what's the story that this war is living in? Option number 1, the story is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay, that's a grand story. And one would argue it starts in 1929 and the massacre of 1929, and then 1936, the Great Arab Rebellion, and then 1947, our War of Independence, which led to a massive catastrophe for the Palestinians that they call the Nakba, and then 67, and then the First Intifada, 1987, and the Second Intifada, 2000, and now October 7th. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a narrative. There's many episodes inside this story. And October 7th is just another episode of the long story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It might be for us the most brutal part, the most painful part, the part that leads to most despair, but yet it's just another piece in a large story. This is the latest episode of a story called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But maybe this war lives in a completely different narrative. Maybe it's not the latest episode of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Maybe it's the first episode or the first battle in the Israeli-Iran war. That's a different narrative. It's a very different narrative. Are we in the middle of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or in the beginning of the Israeli-Iranian conflict or war? By the way, there's a third narrative, which you were alluding to just now. This is the great historian Neil Ferguson. The way he frames what's happening all over the world now is the world has entered the past few years what he calls, and I love this, the way he frames it, Cold War II. Not World War III, but Cold War II. And just like Cold War I, there was not a war between the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, but there were always battles between proxies, right? North Korea, South Korea, Vietnam. There was always with proxies. Also, this new Cold War II, between 2 centers of power, China and the US. Between them, there's always proxies wars. Russia and Ukraine, North Korea, South Korea, Israel, Iran. What's the narrative that we're living in? Is this where we're fighting a part of Cold War II? That would be a global narrative. Is it Israel versus Iran? That would be a regional narrative. Or is it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which will make it a very local narrative? Now, the interesting thing is I've been thinking about this a lot. All narratives are true. You know who Israel is? We're the guy that's on a diet and is keeping kosher. And by the way, he's vegetarian. You're eating a salad and you're living in 3 different stories and they're all true. Yes, we're fighting a war, and this war is obviously a part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's obviously a part of a new world order, something very global. But I think what's happening now is that most Israelis are shifting into the regional narrative. Where most Israelis used to live in the narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and now this is very dramatic in the Israeli psyche, we are relocating ourselves. Just like, how when you change a location, when you move a house, when you find a new apartment, that's dramatic. When you relocate your life into a new narrative, it's as dramatic. The global narrative will never be something, it's too abstract. It's not, Israelis are not going to live, we're part of Cold War II and we're part of the proxies, weakening the different, the centers that are influenced by China.
No, but also because obviously Israel is the center of the world. So how can you say it's between Israel and US and China?
Of course. We're not, we know that's in the background, but I think we're all shifting into the regional narrative. We're moving from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the Israeli-Iranian war. And I think think that's very interesting, and that might even be good news.
One thing that worries me about this realignment of thinking, and I too am seeing it anecdotally with friends, family, etc., is the April attack and what role that plays. And it just, obviously, Iran sent, over 300 missiles, projectiles, drones, blah, blah, blah. And almost nothing landed here. And what did land, unfortunately, one little Bedouin girl was injured quite severely. She's okay now. But what really worries me is how this attack replays into the psyche, the Israeli psyche, the hubris that Israelis have. Ha ha ha, Iran tried to attack us and we beat them, ha ha.
I don't see any ha ha in Israel. Israelis post-October 7th are extremely modest. And I think the Israeli-Iran war is making us even more modest. Because Iran is the kind of enemy that's how Israelis like to see their enemy. Because you see, if it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, who's David and who's Goliath? We feel like we're Goliath. They're weak, we're strong. If it's all part of the Israeli-Iran war, so who's David and who's Goliath? Amanda, Iran is times 9 when it comes to population. I think there are 85 million people. And it's times 60 the size of the country. Oh, and by the way, it's a dynamic society. They have scientists. They're groundbreaking in science and in math. They're an ancient civilization, which is a glorified civilization. This is a serious empire. And when that's our enemy, so we have to be different people if that's our enemy. Every story brings out, like when you live in a different story, it brings out different qualities from you. And by the way, when we move from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict narrative to explaining everything that we're doing as a part of the Israeli-Iran conflict or war, that doesn't mean we need to ignore the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It just means it's put in context. We can't ignore it because if we ignore it, we might lose the war with Iran. But shifting the narrative gives Israelis a sense of agency, that there's something we can actually do here. I'll tell you why. Because when we think that everything that's happening to us is a part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and why is Hezbollah attacking us? It's all about the Palestinians. When that's the narrative, so the only way to somehow find a way out is to solve the conflict. But if we're living in the Israeli-Iran war, the way out is to topple down the regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is, by the way, what most Iranians want also. Now, if you ask Israelis, I'll just ask myself, what has higher probability? Solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or toppling or bringing down the regime in Iran? Now bringing down the regime in Iran is very, very hard. It's not something easy. It's very hard. When we think about probabilities, it's something much more possible than solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is what most Israelis think. So which means when Israelis live in the narrative that all of this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and this conflict is unsolvable, well, that combination leads to despair. But if all of this is a part of the Israeli-Iran war, and when the regime falls, and that's hard, but it's possible, for good reasons it's possible. And this great conversation with Dennis Ross, he explained to me how this could happen. We don't know when, but it's very weak from within the regime, and they have serious problems. And they're out of water, by the way, and the people in Iran don't support their regime. And we see that could happen. And when the regime falls, all their proxies, within a year, 2, 3 years, their terrorist armies are not cutting edge in technology. They become weaker and weaker, and their threat they could present to Israel becomes irrelevant. And by the way, then the Israeli-Palestinian conflict becomes more solvable. So when we shift a narrative, we're shifting from the narrative that's unsolvable to a new narrative that hypothetically is solvable, which gives us a sense of agency. And I have had a conversation with a good friend of mine, which is, I shared these observations with him. I think they're removing a narrative. And what does it mean to live in a new story? This is, by the way, an Israeli general, which is also an intellectual, a very, very smart Israeli officer. His name is Samuel Bumendid, and he's now the chief educator of the Israeli military. Very interesting guy. And I said to him, we're shifting a narrative, and what does that mean? So he pointed my attention at a very interesting direction. There was a moment where Americans, after World War II, thought that they fought a war, they won, and now they're entering a post-war era. We're after the war. But slowly and gradually, they started recognizing, no, that's not the story. We didn't enter a post-war era. We entered a new kind of a war era. We moved from World War II to Cold War, which, by the way, then they didn't know is Cold War I.
There's always a sequel, though, you know?
There's always a sequel. And one of the people that helped Americans understand that they're moving into a new story from a hot war with Germany to a Cold War with the Soviet Union was a diplomat called George Kennan. He wrote what's called the Long Memo in 1946. He was a diplomat, American diplomat in Moscow. And he writes it, the Long Memo, where he describes we're entering a long, long battle with the Soviet Union. And he, by the way, advises not to attack Russia, but to let it collapse into its own contradictions. And I think the way I read his long memo, he's saying the following. The Soviet Union has internal deep contradictions. Also, America does. And there's internal weaknesses within the Soviet Union. There's also internal weaknesses within America. One of these societies eventually is going to collapse into its own tensions, which means who will win the Cold War? One society collapses, the second one prevails. The last man standing wins. This is how it's going to be played out. So towards the end of the memo, George Kennan says, which means we don't only have to weaken the Soviet Union, we also have to strengthen the internal unity in the United States. And he says everything we do in order to strengthen unity in the United States, that's a blow to the Soviet Union. And he showed that to me, and I said, this is our narrative. We are moving from a narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a new narrative of the Israeli-Iran war. And I think inspired by Kennan, this narrative has the potential to bring the best out of us.
Let me ask you some questions
Please.
before we get to the
Please.
resounding theory of everything. And I just, when you're speaking, I just can't be helped but think of our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who for 15 years at least has been the Cassandra in the United Nations, talking about the Iran threat and talking about how Iran is the one that needs to be toppled, et cetera, et cetera. So how does that fit into your unifying theory, especially since he is perhaps the most polarizing figure and is the one, perhaps, arguably the person who makes our internal fabric of our society the weakest?
So there's politicians play two games. There is the politics of persuasion and the politics of motivation. Persuasion is when a politician tries to reach out to people from the other side of the aisle, to speak to them, to tell them, I'm one of yours. And it's okay if you could support me in certain policies. Reaching out. That type of political leader is a uniter. There's a different type of leader, the one that plays not the politics of persuasion, but the politics of motivation, trying to motivate its own base. And the most effective way of motivating your own base is to make it fear the other side of the aisle. So politicians that play the politics of motivation are dividers. Bibi Netanyahu plays the politics of motivation, not of persuasion.
But he was speaking at the United Nations.
I know.
His audience was well beyond Israelis.
So I'm going there, and he plays, and therefore Bibi, sad to say, in his calculation, he accumulates political power not by uniting but by dividing. He's that brand of a politician. That's the tragedy of Netanyahu, and this is the tragedy. In order to beat Iran, we have to unite, and therefore we need leadership that plays the politics of persuasion and not motivation, political leaders that figure out how to accumulate power by uniting and not by dividing. Which takes me to the following conclusion. Bibi is the one that framed the narrative. Many years ago, he was saying, the year is 1939. Iran is Germany. What are you going to do now? He was the prophet of this narrative. And now more and more Israelis are moving and shifting into Bibi's story. My argument is the following. We need to adapt Bibi's narrative. But the meaning of living in Bibi's narrative is divorcing ourselves from Bibi's politics. That's the meaning of adopting Bibi's narrative. Because if you're fighting Iran, if we're in a war with Iran, maybe it's a 10-year war. So Amanda, we need a large army. And if we need a large army, guess what? Ultra-Orthodox have to serve in the army. We used to say ultra-Orthodox have to serve because of shivyon banetel. There is lack of justice. It was a values thing. That's not the argument anymore. You know why the ultra-Orthodox need to serve the army? Because we need to defeat Iran. It used to be that we felt uncomfortable with right-wing racism and extremism. It felt very uncomfortable with that. But now I have a different answer why we can't have governments that are dependent politically on the far right. You know why? Because when we're dependent politically on the far right, we can't create large international and regional coalitions against Iran. So what I'm saying is Bibi's coalition, creating a political dependency on the ultra-Orthodox, and politically, which makes our army small, and political dependency on the far right, which makes Israel more isolated. This is not a coalition that could beat Iran. So, Bibi was right. And that's why his politics are wrong. Bibi was always right. And I think he was the prophet. And to adopt his narrative means we have to shake off his politics. Enlarge the army, which means we can't be politically dependent on the ultra-Orthodox. Build coalitions. We can't be politically dependent on the extremes. And work with the politics of unity, the politics of persuasion, not the politics of motivation and divisive politics. So for all these reasons, because Bibi was right, he's wrong. His politics are wrong. And by adopting Bibi's narrative, that's the best, most efficient way to shake off Bibi's politics.
So you're talking a very long game in what you're saying in shaking off Bibi's politics, because of course the coalition is pretty stable, at least right now. Anything could happen in another minute, right? And the next elections are October 2026. That's 2 years from now. Mm-hmm. So how do we do, as you suggest, to adopt the narrative, and yet our leader is still Benjamin Netanyahu?
You're right, Amanda. What I'm speaking is very long term, and we have immediate problems. And what's also true is that the war with Iran has begun. October 7th was the moment that it began. And now it's only intensifying. And we need new politics in order to defeat Iran. And the critical moments of the war with Iran are with the old politics. That's the problem. That's the catch that we're in. There is an interesting idea in Israel led by an organization called the Riv'on HaRevi'i, the fourth quarter, where they say maybe the way out looks like this. We form a national unity government now. Okay? Which means Gantz, Lapid joined this government. Once they joined, but that's their concession. They joined this government. And what the concession that Bibi has to make is that elections are not in 2 years or in 1 year. So on the one hand, it makes the time that has to pass before we can completely reinvent ourselves shorter, only a year. Until then, we're more protected because we're led by a government that can represent broader unity from within and accumulate more legitimacy from the outside. So I'm a supporter of that move. Will that materialize? Will that happen? I don't know.
Right, that is definitely not in Netanyahu's interest. And then, Micah, of course, it begs the question, okay, say we have elections in a year versus 2 years. Bibi Netanyahu could very easily get elected again. Then what?
Well, my prediction is that there's going to be a tectonic shift in the structure of Israeli politics. Tectonic shift.
That sounds like a good topic for our follow-up conversation, hopefully in less than half a year. And to be continued, Micah. It's always such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.